Okay, good morning. So thanks for the invite from Catapult to start off with. It's great to come along and discuss, hopefully, some of the research in rugby from the past, present and future. A little bit of a background about me. So I have 3 roles at the moment. I'm a senior lecturer at Leeds Beckett. I'm also lead the academy group at Yorkshire Carnegie and research innovation manager at the RFL. If you put all those together, I would classify my probably job role as a very naive optimist at the moment, which is trying to get research, policy and practice to all talk together, which makes sense, but not really when you then get into the detail of it. So in terms of what I'm going to go through today, I'm going to share with you some of my views on research in rugby as a whole. It's not going to be very intensive in terms of specific data and detail, but hopefully it gives people a broad idea of how we can potentially work together for research in rugby in the future. So if I start with the past actually confused me at the start because I was trying to work out when the past was, and the past was technically any time from when I started writing this presentation, which was everything. So the first thing I thought I'd do was actually look at what was out there. And when I did my Scopus search, there was just over 4,500 documents in rugby. Now, granted, all of these aren't going to be relevant rugby documents. But one of the interesting things that I found was that when I searched by author publications, these are the top 5 people between 1847 and 2007. Now, I'm assuming Gabbett started earlier than everybody else, hence why he has nearly 3 times as many publications. But the 5 people who have the most publications within rugby, so Gabbett, Christian Cook, Liam Kildorf, Nick Gill and Kevin Till. One thing that struck me about these is they are all practitioners, or they all were practitioners. And actually, that will be a key theme of today, of aligning kind of the research with the practice. And the reason why I feel pretty strongly about this was I finished my PhD 3 years ago, and I thought at the time I was doing some good research. And I was working for a rugby league club at the time and doing my PhD separately. And my PhD was around hydration and fluid balance. And after 4.5 years writing 100,000 words in this thesis, my conclusion was that rugby players should drink when they're thirsty, which is massively underwhelming if you're trying to help somebody in terms of what they're doing in practice. I could tell you why they drink when they're thirsty and why and all the mechanisms behind it, but in terms of almost an overriding philosophy of research, I started classifying things in 2 ways. Is it interesting or is it helpful? And mine was 100% interesting for me, but it wasn't helpful for anyone because they were doing that anyway. So I think this whole philosophy of having research and practice with feedback mechanisms of questions and also findings makes loads of sense. When you go through the themes and the topics of research, I don't think they've changed. I think that if you go as far back, so the earliest research was on injury surveillance. There's a lot of work at the moment on concussion. There's little bits of research in pockets on some characteristics, but you'd still be surprised on where some of the gaps are. We've got work at the moment on match demands, training load, fatigue and recovery, nutrition and psychology. Now, the match demands in terms of how that research has evolved is kind of coincided with the development of technology. So as we were able to measure it, we did measure it, and then we obviously reported that as research studies. But I think one careful thing we've got to do at the moment is start looking at research we need to do rather than research we can do. And actually, I think they're very different things. So I would say our understanding of the game demand from a high level is reasonable at the moment, but I'll share some new insights later on. The fatigue and recovery research for me was really interesting, and I think that was some key in terms of how practitioners now start planning for the training cycles. So understanding that the potential 48-hour recovery following a game, so in terms of maximising adaptation but also facilitating recovery is logical. But again, in terms of how that's progressed now, I think we're starting to understand more around ways to measure fatigue. So we look at this kind of fatigue recovery profile following a game, measured typically through a counter movement jump. But actually what we're starting to see, and we've done some work, and JB Moran's done some work on this, around the measurements of fatigue are very mode specific. So actually, if you get a decrease in a jump after a game, there's still some other exercise modalities players can do maximally. And we did this when we tracked it longitudinally during the pre-season. So typically, as we'd see, as the training load increased, counter movement jump decreased. During our rest week, we had a rebound, but actually players never recovered to their baseline, so it may not have been a true baseline. But despite all this fatigue, which was deliberate to induce some adaptation, players still improved their speed and their strength. So jump decreased and speed increased. Now, technically, they should be similar, but they're not, because one's a jump and one's a sprint. So actually, in terms of understanding or applying specific research findings into practice, I think that's where we're starting to develop our understanding a little bit further. Injury and training loads, probably the biggest boom in research in the last 2 years, I'd say, or 3 years. And probably thanks to Gabbett and his excellent work. If you work back to 2014, I think, 2011, sorry, one of Gabbett's papers suggesting that the harder rugby league players train, the more injuries they sustain. So from the early work, this was what the research was sharing. And actually, I think we'd all agree that that's probably the shift has changed slightly. Some of Matt Cross's work in rugby union showing that potentially there's a sweet spot. So actually, it's not just how hard they train, it's about getting the training load right. So obviously, the higher training loads, you have a greater likelihood of injury, but equally, the lower training loads. But then in terms of our progression of knowledge and our understanding of that, I think you couldn't do a rugby presentation without this slide, which is everywhere at the moment, is around the smarter and harder. And I think actually, this is for me, one of the real helpful insights from research into practice around this acute chronic training loads to actually allow us to better manage our week-to-week training. But I think one of the things that potentially is missing from this is the coach interaction. Because actually what we've found from some of our work is that the sports scientists in S&C don't prescribe the load, the coach does. So actually this acts as a potential buffer for how to guide the coach, but actually the coach and what they decide to do based on contextual factors of win, loss, home, away, top four, middle four, bottom four, etc. They were the biggest determinants of training load exposure. So I think this, as for us as sports scientists, helps provide some guidelines to actually manage players better and try and keep them injury-free while providing a stimulus to make sure they can perform. So if we go backwards now in terms of some physical characteristics that have been done, this is one of the key areas I feel that research and practice don't talk to each other. So everyone who works in a club, majority of people who work in clubs, test their athletes, agree? Last year, or 2015, was the first time somebody published a study on the physical characteristics of academy rugby union players. Yeah, everybody knew it because everybody did it, but actually there's some real key gaps from information that's out in the practice and that's not in the literature. There's a lot of research at the moment in physical characteristics in rugby league, Kev Till work and Gabbett, but actually you go back through that and the majority of it is from one club. And actually that one club is influenced by that one person. So actually this progression in terms of league-wide data collection and coordination is needed. I'm just going to show you this study because this is really interesting because this study is probably different to a lot out there which show the difference between different athletes. This study was collected on under 15s when they were in a regional academy, and then we followed them back up 10 years later to look at where they progressed to. And we'd logically look at are professional players bigger, stronger, faster, etc. But if you look at the height, actually some of these academy players, so these are the players that progressed into professional academy, these are the players that dropped out of academy into amateur. What this shows actually is, I would say, in reality, there's not a lot going on in height. But the take-home message from this would be, for at that younger age, being tall doesn't mean you're good, but being short means you're bad. And actually, in terms of how we can then usefully share that information, because some of these players that are here are as tall as a professional, but there's no short players that made it professionally. So actually, in terms of how we can then feed this forward to talent ID, talent development, I think is really useful. But I think there's more work that needs to be done in rugby union in this area, which I'll talk about. So if that's our past research, and these 4,500 studies that I couldn't get through in 10 minutes, but I would say that at the moment where we are presently, I think we're at a boom in research. I think we're at a boom in research because there's more people doing applied research, which is where we need to be. I think these research is easier to do in terms of the technology that's available. So if you had to look at the match demands, compare collecting GPS data to manually coding what an athlete does. There's more journals out there, there's more PhD students. So actually, presently, I think with this research boom, and the challenges have now changed. The challenges aren't about doing research. The challenges are sharing research. Because we've almost got this dichotomy at the moment with all this excellent work that's going on in research, and actually practitioners who don't know about it. Because why would they know about it? Because they're busy. They're the busiest people in the industry. So actually, at present, I think what we need to do is look at ways in which we can bridge that. This is pretty much my teenage years. By teenage years, I mean, it was probably about 28. And for me, this kind of sums up research and practice. And research and practice should be, and policy should be the same thing. Of course it should, because everyone has the same goals. Everybody wants to increase knowledge, progress athletes, etc. But actually, sometimes they don't have fun together, and then you kind of end up where you have a split. So I think the best way I can describe this is that if research and practice have broken up, it's probably because research is pretty complicated and practice is pretty needy. I did get told off doing this slide by my girlfriend this morning for calling her needy. So I think we're here. I think at the moment, research and practice want to work together, but they don't quite work together like they should or as efficiently as they should. And this is why, because in theory, and I'm talking now as my university hat, in theory and practice are the same thing. Why would there not be? Surely you all do things properly and you all standardise things and you calibrate equipment. In practice, they're not. They're very different. The aims are different. The challenges are different. They're completely different. But it doesn't mean that actually the theory isn't useful, because we need data, otherwise we're just using opinions. But on the flip of it, not everything that can be counted counts, and not everything that counts can be counted, which is really important for when we're sports scientists working with coaches. Because the number of false positives that we have, look, I found this, and actually you look at it and it's not relevant, it doesn't do what we thought it did. So I think these are kind of three things that can kind of guide future directions. And for those people that some people may or may not have been involved in the research process. So this is simplistically how I break the research process down. You create a research question, you gain ethics approval, you recruit voluntary participants, you collect data, you analyse data, you write the research paper, you submit a paper for peer review, then the paper's published and knowledge is created. That's the process. I would be very surprised if people can create a research question and publish a paper in 18 months, and that paper is actually physically there to read in 18 months. So surely that as a generating knowledge to share and help doesn't quite work. I also think there's a misstep as well in terms of, rather than creating knowledge to then build future questions, let's try and see if we can make it stick in practice. And if it doesn't, maybe our question was wrong. So that's an extra step. For me, there's 4 steps in this which don't work. And there's 4 fundamental errors that we as research and practitioners need to get right. The first one's the research question. If you fundamentally start with the wrong research question, as a researcher, I guarantee you won't be able to recruit good participants. And actually, when we get to this point and if we start recruiting sub-elite participants, you guys working with elite don't want to read it because they're different. They've got completely different physiology. The next part is in terms of how we then share knowledge. That paper published that no one can get access to, that no one has time to read, those 40,000 papers in rugby that have been published. And actually then that final step of, can you make it stick in practice? And if not, why? Because if we can start challenging the why doesn't it stick, then actually we can start then creating new research questions which can help everybody. I'm going to give you 3 examples of where I think research has made an interesting contribution. The first one's hydration, where I did my PhD. So, hydration, basically, researchers being paid for by sports companies, got participants, they told you're not allowed to drink, you're allowed to drink as you were before, told everyone how bad it was not to drink, so told everyone how they need to drink and not to drink, and now we tell athletes that they shouldn't drink as much like they were before. We basically created a problem that didn't exist, fixed it, and now we're fixing the problem on the reverse. The other one is supplements. We invested so much time, money and resource into ergogenic practices and supplements. We're now spending so much time, money and resource into stop taking supplements, eat whole food like you were before. And the other one is then recovery, a great body of work on recovery, on showing how you can reduce fatigue markers and how ice baths are efficient at reducing fatigue markers, but they also blunt adaptation. So stop using ice baths like you were before. That make sense? So these are examples of 3 things that potentially, and you know, that's not to belittle the area of work, because that's some excellent stuff in there, but 3 examples of where without talking together during the process, I don't think it makes sense. So if you look at what research has done and the contributions we've had, if we use this as the athlete in terms of the 20, 30 years ago, the amount of sports science that has gone into developing the athlete, both in terms of physiology, physical markers, etc., we've managed to progress the athlete from what would be an old car to actually something that's pretty fast. And actually, this is probably where we're at with the athlete at the moment and the knowledge of sports science that's out there in rugby. For me, there's one thing that doesn't work. The road. Nobody's considered the contextual factors of the road. The reason that guy just popped up on the screen, this is Avon Van Hagen, who is a public health researcher in injury. This is his analogy, so in case someone put a photo, I didn't want him to think I'd stolen it without acknowledging him. But actually, if we start spending more time on the road, we'll start getting faster cars. And the road is the context, it's the contextual challenges around playing schedules, it's around age grouping, it's around at what age can you sign players, it's around the reality is that not all athletes are the same. This is the road for me that then hopefully can help progress that. And there's been different ways in which, suggestions in which we can do that. Aaron Coots' suggestion is that you have the practitioner who works fast, and alongside that you have the researcher who works slow. And actually, those fast questions that the researcher has minutes to make a decision on, you know, the best analogies are that if an athlete comes and jump, you have 5 minutes to decide whether they train or not. If I'm a researcher, an athlete jumps, I might take it back to the lab, I might recalibrate my kit, I might look at some other variables, I might collect some more data. It might take months to do that. They're not the same. The reality is that the question's the same, the process is very different. Despite this being a logical model, for me, I think there's one fundamental flaw in it. And I think that I don't believe that we in sport have an infrastructure to use research at the moment. I think that what happens at the moment is there's some really good stuff in practice, there's some really good stuff in research, but actually the infrastructure isn't there to maximise both of them, and I'll share what I mean by that later. So in terms of solutions to the four challenges in the research process, I would say when you create research questions, research questions must be created by both researchers and practitioners or those in policy to make sure they're relevant, make sure they're contextually important, make sure they add value. If you get the question right, and we've got some real good experience of this, if you get the research right, you will get access to elite athletes because people want to know what the answers are because they help. And then the last part is, then we look at how we then share that method, because actually a mean with a standard deviation gives people in practice very little. They may want individual data, they may want different trends. And then try and integrate those findings back in. And one of my beliefs with around this is actually people in practice learn more from the research process than they do from the research findings. So if researchers and practitioners can work together in this process, I think there'll be more sharing of knowledge and better insights for the end research as well from what the practitioner or person in policy is making, or technology. But not forgetting these two important parts, that the electric light did not come from continuous improvements of candles. And actually, if Henry Ford had asked people what they wanted, they'd have said faster horses. So the researcher and the practitioner working together isn't just a continuous development of the same thing. There is some creativity there and there is some innovation, but actually fundamentally we've got to make sure that we work together. And I think if you then ask any academic or researcher the biggest challenges, it would relate to this slide, because you can only have two of those three things. If you've got good, cheap and fast, good and cheap won't be fast, fast and good won't be cheap, and cheap and fast won't be good. So for me, the key one to work with around this is defining what your good is. Because good isn't always complicated. Good is just relevant and helpful. And actually, the best research studies for the practitioners, and I think Gabbett does a phenomenal job of this, he just asks the right questions. So actually, if you define what your good is at the start, then actually you can start then making a more efficient and smooth process in terms of doing research, translating research, and applying research. And what I'm talking about now, I think it's not a thing in rugby, it's across the board in terms of you look at the wealth of knowledge in academia and researchers, and the biggest challenge at the moment is finding mechanisms to translate that. And I stole this off Twitter that from a conference that athletes need to be more like scientists and scientists need to be more like athletes. I think that if you ended up trying to get scientists to be athletes, you'd end up with a group of people like this. But for me, to create that infrastructure and that process, I think we need to start acknowledging and developing a research practitioner, which is a different role to what people do, going back to their actual challenges and their actual time commitments. And this is where the future I think needs to go in rugby. And there's loads of examples of this. I had a PhD student who was doing some work in football, and he was funded by the university, and he was looking at maturation and physical development. And he was going around asking clubs if he could fitness test their athletes. And on the flip of that, you had someone in a club who was fitness testing athletes and had no time to fitness test athletes. If they'd have just spoken to each other at the start, they'd have saved each other loads of time and effort. So to bridge the research and practice, I think we need this research practitioner, which provides the gift of context, insight, idiosyncrasies in terms of what does and doesn't work in specific sports, and also being pragmatic as well in terms of these managing expectations. And this is, I think, where the future needs to go to create an infrastructure. Because if everyone had one of these people in a club, you wouldn't need to go back and search the literature, because this person's job is to A, provide insight back into research of what are the relevant questions and challenges, and B, provide then knowledge and insight back into research from where the current literature is at. And we've developed this within Rugby League, which to me makes sense. And we've called it the Rugby League Applied Science Project, whereby the club and the Rugby Football League and the university all work together to actually joint appoint a researcher, which means from a sport point of view, you actually then have direction, because again, going back to the challenge of the research cycle, I don't know what other researchers are doing until they publish it. And that's 18 months, sometimes 2 years after they did it. The amount of work that's going on that's the same doesn't make sense. So actually, if someone from a sport level had an overview and a guidance and a steer on the work that was going on, you could make sure that actually the research was positively benefiting the sport. The club would obviously benefit in terms of having that research practitioner, and the university would benefit then from actually being able to translate their findings and share their findings beyond the traditional means. And I think what this would also do, it would encourage sharing of data, because the competitive edge comes from how you use data, not the data that you hold. And actually, when you realise if you do a study with a group of athletes, you get no competitive edge anyway when you publish it, because you did it 2 years ago. And you've changed what you've done. Going back to the learning from the process. So this is how I believe the future should look in terms of this kind of joint approach to research, this shared investment in research, because actually you go back to what people want to do, and that satisfies all aims. Clubs don't have a lot of resource, so they want some practical experience, they want some contextual insight, they can add some day-to-day needs for research, and actually what they get at the end of it is bespoke research, and they get some expertise through the universities. National governing bodies, again, can provide some research coordination. They get an increased support for their players in the sport, and they also get development opportunities for staff within the sport as well. So you help retain the staff. Universities get PhD students, they get to contribute in terms of their academic expertise, potential future research opportunities. So just to finish with actually an example of some data to show this. So when I searched for match demands in rugby, I came up with 178 papers showing the whole game match demands, or showing the match demands in some context. So in practice, you're not going to read all of them. Actually, in practice, we want something that feeds back a little bit quicker. So this was a study that we did where we looked at where, because of the contextual challenges from what we were seeing on the pitch and what we were seeing in literature, we challenged a little bit more. So if this is the GPS trace, then we look at the average demands from the whole game. Actually, these peak demands are probably the most important. But if you look at what the research is, majority of the research is doing, it's reporting whole or half game demands. So this is in rugby union in academy players. So most people would agree that backs do more running than forwards in a game of rugby union. Agree? So what we did, we took 2 seasons worth of data. Dale did. He took 2 seasons worth of data and he split the data whistle to whistle, and he classified it based on ball out of play, attack and defence, which contextually makes sense. So when we looked at attack, there was no difference between forwards and backs. When we looked at defence, forwards did more running than backs. Backs did their extra running, accumulated their extra running when the ball was out of play, actually repositioning. So contextually, we wouldn't probably focus on this as a movement activity to winning, because it's probably got nothing to do with scoring tries and saving tries. So again, from what we saw and what we were seeing in literature and what we saw in practice, this allowed us to progress some of these new insights. And I think people are now starting to look at the peak demands. And then I think it's now the responsibility for the technology companies to then provide an easy way of actually quantifying that as well. Last bit, we all know around acute chronic ratios, we all know around now how players should periodise. For those that work in academy rugby, you'll know it's a nightmare because players don't get signed till 18. So actually players pre-18 play for schools, clubs and the academy, and train for schools, clubs and the academy. So we looked at our best players, we took 20 of those, so these are our best in the squad, and looked at, on average in a 12-week period, what did they do activity-wise. So they had GPS units for any time they did PE, played football, etc. And you can see there in terms of both time spent working and also activity profiles, this huge range. We know it's not right, but it exists. It exists now. This is 2017 data. And actually, you can see this huge variability within our best squad. But to me, it gets more interesting because over this 12-week periods, some of these players were covering 6K a week and the same player was covering 26K a week. You would never advocate that as a practitioner. But that's not, this is the reality in the context, that you've got lots of different coaches inputting into the same player. Again, you can see here, players covering up to nearly 28K in a week. It makes no sense, but actually, until we show that this organised chaos exists, I think that we won't start trying to fix those problems. So the way to then progress the research and actually get this a better coordinated approach is to stop looking at things in isolation as well. So there's a lot of injury surveillance, a lot of training load, a lot of match demands, a lot of physical development work. So we're working at the moment with Bath on a study with a league-wide study with the RFU on injury, training load and development. Because actually if you get them all in the mix, then it'll start making sense. Because actually if a player is getting injured frequently and not physically developing because of a training load occurs, we can then start managing and manipulating exposures to positively influence where players progress to. And hopefully, by creating this shared approach and this shared agenda to research in terms of a practitioner's input and also the research and practice do have fun together and get on better and fall in love. So here are my do's and buts. I think we need to align research and practice better in terms of the questions, but we need to fundamentally acknowledge that they're both different. They're both completely different in terms of what their drivers are, but they can have the same aim. We need to define research questions from practice, but be open to suggestions and also acknowledge that they may not work. But actually, this allows us to go from the candle to the light bulb. Share resources and data. The best data is in practice. And actually, researchers then go and spend time collecting the same data that already exists. So if we can share resources and data, I think that would help. But appreciate everyone else's other commitments in terms of what a practitioner uses data for and how long it takes a researcher to use the data. Agree feedback mechanisms and timelines, but also appreciate each other's time constraints, which are, again, unique. Agree outcomes at the start. So the two fundamental outcomes of research, I think, are either knowledge or application. Knowledge is as useful as application because it helps us all learn in terms of what did and didn't work. Just because it doesn't fit, doesn't stick, doesn't mean it's bad. And be optimistic, yet be pragmatic in terms of what actually will work and what actually will help. And that's it. Thank you.
Any questions for me?
Yes, I know.
John, first one, would you advocate so that a club, a university and a government or a union body would get together to supplement a position within, say, I'm speaking from an RFU position, that each of the provincial teams would have a researcher / practitioner assisting the teams that are already in place?
100%.
And then what would be the outcome of that? Like, would you feel that that person would, what's the end result for that person once their research and PhD is completed? Obviously, hypothetically, you can only speculate on what they would do.
What in terms of for that person?
For that person or for that club, there's a continuous cycle where you then re-employ another person who starts a PhD and continues their research, or?
So one of the drivers for us was in doing this was when I was working in the Rugby League club and also Rugby Union, was if you work in a management position, it's really hard to find part-time staff who stay, good part-time staff who stay. The reality is you need part-time staff because you don't have the budget for full-time staff. And if you look at some squads, you have 5 squads in at the same time. So actually 5 part-time staff are better than 1 full-time staff. Staff turnover was a challenge. And actually, it was unfair for what we expected that person to do. So if the cost of the club is X, but actually they can supplement that X with from a governing body who have loads of questions and a university who want to help and also invest in research, that person then, A, has a solid position for 3 years, rather than this transient moving around, and everybody benefits. In terms of what they do, I think that the PhDs are interesting because why couldn't, and by saying this, I'm not saying that everybody needs a PhD, because actually some people with PhDs are bad coaches and another way around. But actually, why couldn't more people in practice have PhDs and research experience? Therefore, it makes the whole process even easier. Because, if you have a team of 5 S&C coaches and 2 have PhDs and 3 from a coaching background, then that whole research feeding process is just so much more efficient, rather than generalising somebody doing an undergrad, master's, PhD, being an academic, and then having conversations where you're not even speaking the same language. So that's kind of my idea. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah.
I'm not trying to do you out of a job. Yes.
Yes, thanks, Ben. Just to come back on a point that you made around, you mentioned the 18 months to publish a paper, for example. So my question is around the pros and cons of social media and what your thoughts are on that, because people can do a lot of case studies internally, which could go through that process, potentially and pass it, but it takes 30 seconds to put a tweet out. And is it possible in some instances doing more harm than good?
Yeah.
Because when it goes on Twitter, it should go. That's the assumption.
Yeah. Again, peer review isn't a... So publications, because it's slow, doesn't mean it's bad. It means it's thorough. And on the whole, if a published paper, most of the time, it ends up reasonable. Because it's been through that kind of check and challenge of the beam through peer review. So I would class that as evidence. Stuff on Twitter I class as ideas and opinions. Doesn't mean they're wrong, but they're not evidence. But actually, I think part of it is almost aligning those feedback plans. You see some stuff on Twitter and it's not right, But then, and equally, then you don't want to get into a 140 character Twitter war when you can't actually discuss, share anything. So things like podcasts. But actually, for me, fundamentally, academics and researchers and practitioners just don't speak enough. And I've been to loads of academic conferences where people stand in and present great practical research, and there's not one practitioner in the audience. And likewise, the other way around. And I think that having shared conferences, again with coaching, science and medicine as well, because we're going to get to a point where we saturate sports science, then we need to start working with coaches and work with the medicine as well. So they're kind of my ideas around dissemination. So I think it's one form of mechanism of feedback. I think it's a potentially dangerous one, but that's not saying it always is. Because anyone can write a blog and just say whatever they want, can't they? Does that answer your question?
Fantastic. Thank you very much.